All right. As I said, thank you so much, Rebecca, for meeting with me today. I will just start by asking, what is your role as a director of resilience? And I'm just curious about your background.
Sure. As director of resilience, I oversee the grants, a couple of grants for my department, which is through the Department of Housing. And these are disaster recovery funds that came to the state of Connecticut as a result of damage the state incurred during Superstorm Sandy. And so these funds come from the federal government through U.S. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to the Department of Housing. And you may have heard about disaster recovery dollars in the news after big storms that have happened recently. So this is a common program, and they come through the Community Development Block Grant Program. And that's why they go through the Department of Housing, because Community Development Block Grant run by HUD is usually operated by Departments of Housing in states.
Okay.
And so, but a little bit different than how disaster recovery funds are usually put out is that I run these resilience grants, which were a special program under Sandy. They were design competitions. So they put together design leaders and architects and engineering firms to sort of promote innovative approaches to resilience as part of disaster recovery. And so I was a part of the state entering those competitions, and so when the state was awarded the funds, I became involved with the projects and implementing the projects. But I only came into the position as director of the Department of Housing in April of 2018. Prior to that, I was involved with the projects, but in my previous role, which was Director of Community Engagement at the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And that was at the University of Connecticut. And that's basically, it's a research center, but it also has a big part of its mission to make that research applicable, actionable science to help municipalities in Connecticut make decisions about resilience and recovery.
Okay.
So that was the position I was in prior to coming to Department of Housing. My training is as an earth scientist. I have a doctorate in earth sciences. I have a master's in soil science, and my undergraduate was in environmental science and chemistry. But after I finished my doctorate, I worked in Washington, D.C. in this program called the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. The AAAS is the largest organization of scientists, and they publish Science Magazine, and they run this Science and Technology Policy Fellowship program that its mission is to get more scientists involved in policy making. So I worked for Congress for a year through that program, and I worked for EPA for 2 years as a fellow in that program. And then I'm from Connecticut originally, so after going out of state to do most of my degrees and then working in D.C., I came back to Connecticut when the University of Connecticut created the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation.
Okay, wow, that sounds really interesting. So you definitely have a lot of experience with that. So as you said, going into my next question, so Resilience Bridgeport kind of began due to the impact that Superstorm Sandy had.
That's correct.
Okay. So basically that's kind of what brought up this program. And so the effects of the national disasters and flooding, like how does it directly affect Bridgeport and the environment and the community?
Well, there's multiple impacts. What we know where it flooded during that storm. We know that the area where we are implementing these projects. We got funding from the department. Those areas flooded. There was damage to homes. There were flooded streets. There were major power outages in the area because substations were turned off, so power was out for many days in these storms. So we know that people, thankfully there was no loss of life in Bridgeport, but there was certainly a lot of damage to homes, a lot of flooded basements, a lot of damaged vehicles, but the power outages also caused sort of this ripple effect, and there was a study done that was funded by Connecticut Sea Grant. I can't remember which university did it, but they did a survey, asking to respondents about evacuation, and we learned from that low-income residents in Bridgeport and even in this neighborhood didn't evacuate, in part because they were concerned, because the power was out in their homes, they were concerned about keeping the contents of their refrigerator, like using it up or trying to otherwise preserve it, because they are in such a financial situation that even losing the food in their refrigerator would mean that they wouldn't have enough resources to replace that food. So when people are living at that kind of a socioeconomic situation, their ability to cope with and adapt to and be resilient to disasters is there. It's already a very challenging place. So we know that from Katrina, research out of New Orleans, that low-income neighborhoods don't recover as quickly or never recover as compared to wealthier neighborhoods. So that underlying socioeconomic problems contribute to a community's ability to be more or less resilient. So it's like there's the direct impacts in Bridgeport of flooding, but then there's also kind of these impacts that exacerbate underlying conditions that always happen, that are always there, like socioeconomic challenges in the neighborhood.
Okay, wow. So that's why you have basically the 3 projects within the one, and one of them is the Resilience Center. So that's the goal to just provide resources and education for them, for the ones that can't really afford to flee, or
Yeah, that's part of the goals of the Resilience Center, is to be an educational resource to help community members who, particularly those who we know are less able to take advantage of resources, have less capacity maybe to take advantage of resources as compared to wealthier communities. But then we just also know that in this neighborhood, from working with them for many years on these projects, that there's just an overall sort of poor understanding of the impacts of climate change. And that's also not just in this neighborhood. I mean, that's all of the Connecticut coastline, which I'm familiar with from working with the Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, or CIRCA is what we call it at UConn. So that's not necessarily just this neighborhood, but that's all sort of coastal municipalities. Their understanding of sea level rise, of how that's going to change, what they experience now is not what they'll experience in the future. So the Resilience Center is kind of about that underlying education component. But the goals of the project as we implement them are sort of twofold, in that it's to, first and foremost, to address the immediate risks of the neighborhood to flooding, which is a predominant problem, coastal storm surge flooding. And then this neighborhood also experiences sort of chronic flooding issues from stormwater, rainwater issues. But that also that how we implement the project should help strengthen the overall resilience of the community by creating better economic opportunities, to the extent that we can do that. So some of the things that we're doing, basically by addressing the flood risk, we're also making it a neighborhood that is safer to live in, is also, hopefully would increase people's property values, and make it an area that is more able to have economic development opportunities that is sort of currently part of the challenges that they're dealing with of economic development opportunity in this neighborhood is that it floods so regularly. So it has problems developing beyond that.
Okay. So as you mentioned, clearly it's obviously way complex. There's a lot of direct and indirect consequences of the flooding and just the natural disasters in general. So my last question is, part of the environmental impact statement is just looking at the pros and cons of the environmental factors. So some of the pros I kind of picked out were the environmental justice. So there's no discrimination of people that live in Bridgeport. Like everybody's getting equal access to the resources and the goals of all the projects, and then also natural resources. So, and then the cons that I picked out were, hold on one second. The hazardous materials. So obviously, like with construction, there's release of lots of dust, there's the noise pollution, and then air quality. Did you guys struggle with the project with any of those cons? Like, how did you overcome those?
Yeah. So a lot of those effects are typical of any major construction project. The sort of the good news about many of those impacts is that they're temporary because they're related to construction. Mm-hmm. So they're not like a permanent aspect of the project. So they'll happen, and we'll use best management practices to minimize them. But they'll be done. They'll end when construction is done. So it's not a permanent impact to the neighborhood. One of the sort of con impacts to the neighborhood is that there's just going to be a large piece of infrastructure in the neighborhood that wasn't there before. And in this case, the major part of the project is building a coastal flood defense system, which is a flood barrier. And because it has to stop coastal storm surge, it naturally, in order to do that, you have to put a barrier between the community and the water. And so it's sort of that's just endemic to what the project is. Like, if your goal of your project is to, stop floodwaters from coming into the neighborhood, you have to put in a flood barrier. So it's not something you can avoid if you want to achieve the goal of the project. But that kind of a structure is, because it's a very low-lying area, they're very close to sea level, the structure itself in some places will be 11 feet above grade. So it's going to change the topography of the neighborhood. And what we've done to mitigate that as much as possible is we're using sort of urban design elements to try to blend it into the landscape as much as we can. We're ramping streets so that vehicles can still get up and over it. Where we can't ramp a street, we're making bicycle and wheelchair pedestrian accessible ways to get up and over the flood barrier, so that the goal of the project is not to keep people from moving across this barrier, because most of the time it won't be in use. We don't get hurricanes all that frequently, and so most of the time it will just be in the part of the landscape and not be being used on a regular basis. So knowing that, we want to make sure that the public still can, use their neighborhood, keep access to the park, to Seaside Park, which is going to be on the outside of the flood barrier. So that's been something that has come up with the community. When people have had concerns about the project, it's the impact of how this structure will change the look and feel of the neighborhood. And that's been the most challenging part of the project, is finding that balance of, well, if you want to achieve this goal, then this is what you have to design, and there's not really a lot of getting around that, and you have to put it somewhere. So how do you find what minimizes the impacts of that, while also making sure that you still get the benefits of the flood risk reduction?
Right. So just like any environmental or public health project, I guess like you just have to look at the